Welcome to Her Desired Haven Podcast, a community where we come together to discuss all things Jesus, family, life, and faith. I am your host, LaShondra. Thank you so much for tuning in with us today. Today, our next guest is a family recovery coach, an interventionist, speaker, and author. Through powerful interventions in his one-of-a-kind online coaching program for parents, he supports families as they navigate the heartbreak and challenges of loving someone battling drug or alcohol addiction. His journey into his work began after the tragic loss of his oldest son, Chase, who died in a marijuana-impaired car crash in 2014, following an 18-month struggle with addiction. Since then, he has made it his mission to walk alongside families, offering guidance, tools, and hope during some of their most difficult moments. Today on the show, he will share valuable insights on how parents can support a child struggling with addiction, set healthy boundaries, and begin their own journey of recovery. Please welcome Darryl Rodgers to the show.
Thank you, LaShondra. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on the show today. So many parents are faced with the struggle of watching their children suffer and go through so many things and struggles of many kinds, right? And not really fully knowing how to help them or support them while they're going through it. What do you wish that you knew that you understand now, but back then you had no clue about helping a child who was struggling with addiction?
Well, it really comes down to boundaries. You know, we all tend to want to protect our children, especially once they're using drugs and alcohol and have a problem with that. You know, it really changes their brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, in a way that they're behaving usually much like they're much younger than their biological age. And so our parenting instincts are to protect, to nurture, to rescue. And we're treating them like they're much younger than they are. And then that tends to create this negative cycle because they don't like to be treated like they're 13 when they're 20, even though they're behaving like 13. They can't see that. And so it just
Mm-hmm.
starts this sort of negative cycle, parents enabling, keeping their child stuck in their addiction, keeping them stuck emotionally, and also keeping the parents stuck in this situation where oftentimes their adult child is living in their home with them, and they feel like they're prisoners in their own home.
You don't just focus on the drug addiction. You also help families who have people struggling with alcohol addiction as well, correct?
Yes, yes. And I guess, technically alcohol is a drug. We tend to not think of it that way or talk about it that
Yeah.
way. But yeah, it's just become so acceptable in our society, alcohol use. And it really is. I see a lot of problems with alcohol. Man, I have some really heartbreaking stories around some of that. Young man who I was trying to intervene. His family wanted me to do an intervention. Well, his mother did, but there was one member of the family that was not going along with the program. It was a grandmother, and he lived in his
Hmm.
grandmother's house, and she would not set the boundaries that she needed to, just out of fear. That is a big thing, that parents in this
Hmm.
situation have a lot of fear. And he eventually got so bad, he ended up. His sister checked on him one day. He lived in sort of like a mother-in-law suite, at his grandmother's
Hmm.
house. But his sister went to check on him, and he was doing so bad, she got him into the ER, and he needed a liver, and he declined it, and he went back to his grandmother's house, and that's where he passed
Wow.
away, unfortunately. Fear is a liar, and we tend to get caught up in the what ifs. Well, what if I do this and that happens? Or what if I do that and this happens? And we just really have to lean on God and trust God with our children. They're not our children anyway. I mean, they are, in a sense, and they're in our care, but ultimately they're God's children, and we have to trust God
Hmm.
with the plan. And I use a metaphor. I talk about archery a lot, and I can't remember the scripture verse right now, but I think it's in Psalm
Hmm.
where it talks about children being like arrows, and blessed is the man who has a quiver full of them. So if you think about an arrow, An arrow is meant to put on the bowstring and to launch, and it's really to launch at the enemy, which is the forces of evil and
Mm-hmm.
forces of darkness. And so, but if you put that arrow on the bowstring and you pull it back and you're looking at the target, the longer you hold on to the arrow and the bowstring, once you get it back, the more tension there is in your muscles. You feel your muscles begin to burn and quiver, the less likely you are to have a smooth release. And you
Mm-hmm.
really want a smooth release and once that arrow has left the bowstring, it's in God's hands. You have to trust God with the flight of the arrow. And I see parents who are running alongside the arrow trying to get it back on course, but we have to trust God that, I have a good friend who's in long-term recovery who is an interventionist, a very successful interventionist. And he says, don't rob your children of an experience they need to have in order to be able to grow into the person they were created to be. And I love that quote. I think it's so powerful, and sometimes it's scary, but sometimes we have to allow them to have that experience some of the consequences of their choices. The pain is greater than that desire for the drugs or the alcohol, and it just motivates them to change. The pain has to become greater than the fear of change so that they reach a point
Mm-hmm.
of really desperation where they may not want to go get help, but where they're willing to accept help, the right kind of help.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest part as a parent because we raise our kids up a certain way and we just expect them to go down this certain path, but to let them go and really I think it's the hardest part. Even for believers, that's the hardest part. But once again, we are stewards over our children. It's not our job to control them, but to train them up, to teach them, and then let them go and make their own decisions and mistakes and learn.
Yeah, yeah. There's sort of a transition time there when children are growing from teenagers into adults. It requires a lot of discernment and a lot of wisdom. Like where do I exert
Mhm.
my parental authority and where do I pull back and then learn to allow them? You really have to trust God in that and learn to allow them to make some of those mistakes, that and to suffer some
Mhm.
of the consequences. But as they become an adult, we have to really pull back on that to allow them to grow. You're right; it's scary. I hear parents say, "I'll never abandon my child," or "I'll never turn my back on my child." And I'm not saying you should give up on your child. And I'm not saying that in every case they need to
Mhm.
be kicked out of the house. And they're an adult who's living in your house doesn't necessarily mean they need to be kicked out. Again, discernment and wisdom is required there, but it's releasing attempts to control. If you're doing
Mhm.
something for another adult, including your adult child, that they could be and should be doing for themselves, you're really hurting them.
I know that you're very passionate. You put a great emphasis on healing together as a family. A lot of times
Yeah.
the attention and focus is solely on the person who is actually struggling, but you believe that you have to recover and heal together because the whole family is impacted, right?
Yes, yes, that's very important. And, that's not something that is being addressed by many people. And it's just not, there aren't many people who do what I do, unfortunately. And I think a lot of treatment centers recognize the need for it now, but there's still most treatment centers
Mhm.
do not have robust family recovery programs. So let's say you have an intervention and your child goes to treatment or however they end up in a treatment program, and there's a whole list of things there. Part of the coaching is trying to help parents pick out a good program. Most of the time, I recommend a much longer. There are 30-day programs, but there's so many different
Mhm.
things to look at. There aren't a lot of good Christian programs that have a clinical component to them. So finding a
Mhm.
good Christian program that has a psychiatrist on staff and has medical staff and has their own detox and all of that combined is really difficult.
What are some, I guess, some first steps that families can take to recover and heal together?
Let's just say their child goes to treatment. That's the perfect time. And we don't have to wait until they get there, but
Mm-hmm.
If they are in treatment, the parents, I would start with the parents. The parents could work with the family recovery coach. And it's really about learning to manage their emotions, because what happens is
Mm-hmm.
the addicted individual is very good at it's not the person. Your child is in there, right? But they're battling this
Mm-hmm.
addiction, and the addiction does not want to let go, and so it's very manipulative. And you can imagine that if the parents do not have really, really good communication skills, if they do not have emotional management under control, then their child can easily manipulate them into giving them the things that they want. So it's usually not recommended, or at least I usually do not recommend, that the child move back in with the parents after treatment. The goal is for them to be able to transition into independent adult living as they go through this process, recovery. Usually the family just has not had enough time to get all of the education and and to be able to build up, to become resilient enough to not cave in when their child moves back in. A lot of times they will, even in their communications, they may say something that will end up
Mm-hmm.
triggering their child and cause them to feel stress and then want to go back out and use again. So I think it's important that they become resilient, that they get the education that they need, and that's where a family recovery coach can come in, and with siblings as well, and other family members.
Okay, so when you first heard about your son Chase's addiction, you panicked and you said that you made a lot of parenting mistakes. Can you share with our community what you would like them to learn from your mistakes so that they don't make the same?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, if you suspect they're using drugs or alcohol, before you even get to that point, hopefully, try to set up a relationship where they feel comfortable coming to you and talking to you about problems. Um, you know, my wife, Chase would go to my wife with things, and I would say, and then she would tell me, and I would say, well, why didn't he come to me? Well, he didn't feel safe coming to me because I was the disciplinarian, and so
Mhm.
he would go to her. And if he would have, I would have been a lot more, I don't know, maybe I would have been kind of hard. I have the military background and everything, but I have a heart, I'm very compassionate, and there's a side of me that would have welcomed, his desire to reach out and ask questions. I have a really good relationship with our younger son now. He's 25, and he shares things with me all the time and asks me questions about things. But that's one of the things. I think the other thing is that if you discover that they're using drugs, or you suspect, let's just go with that first, you suspect, don't spy on them to try to find out, because I think we want to know for sure, and I would say, respect their privacy. Yes, if they're a teenager, you do have a right to, they're living in your house. You do have the right to say, okay, these are the boundaries. I'm going to go into your room. I'm going to
Mhm.
search. I'm going to, if you're using the phone and I'm paying for it, then there, some of the rules are, I can go into your phone anytime I want to and look. Those, but you really need to set those ground rules up in advance. But
Mhm.
once they're an adult, that changes a little bit. I would say, don't panic and have a knee-jerk reaction where you start yelling at them. That was probably one of the biggest things I wanted to get across here, because then the lines of communication shut down, and then you really don't know what's going on. They'll just cut you
Mhm.
off altogether. If they do go to treatment, don't let them come move back into your house. That was another big mistake that I made. But one of the best things that I did was having an intervention for Chase, because it broke the cycle that we were in, and
Mhm.
it was a pattern interrupt that allowed him to get into treatment and start getting better.
You spoke about healthy boundaries and kind of about enabling. How can a parent begin to identify when they're helping their child as opposed to enabling their child when they're going through something like this?
Think of it like cheerleading versus caretaking. or caretaking versus
Mm-hmm.
cheerleading. If you have a younger child, you're their caretaker. If you're dealing with an adult child, you should not be doing anything for them that they could be and should be doing for themselves. If especially once they have a drug or alcohol problem. If you're giving them money, if they're living in your house and they're capable or they're old enough that they should be able to have a job and have their own place. Now I know a lot of things changed with COVID, and I know it's
Mm-hmm.
the way. I was just having a conversation yesterday on the airplane with a young man from South Africa about this because of their cost of living and things are, and he lives in the UK now in London, but to buy a house there compared to what I mean, it's astronomical. But even here, the way prices have increased, it's so hard for young people to be able to afford a house. I get that, but they have to find their own way. They can't stay in your house forever. They have to be able to get out on their own. And so but if you're paying their phone bill and you're providing a phone for them and you're giving them money, feeding them, and all of these things that they should be doing for themselves. If they're driving your car, you're paying their car insurance, things like that. You have to start, and you have to build the boundary muscle sometimes because if you've been doing this for a while, to just say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to stop doing all of those things and tell you to move out, that's kind of drastic. But maybe you start with something small and start just kind of gradually working in.
Right. Kind of easing your way into it. And I think that'll be good for
Yeah.
the child too. It won't be such of a
Yeah.
shock all at once.
And it really depends on the situation. If it's a crisis situation, it may need to be a little bit shocking, but yeah, you're right. It is,
Mm-hmm.
for everybody involved, if you can start gradually move in.
So how did losing your son and watching him go through all this, how did that impact your faith in God?
I had a really solid foundation. My father was a Southern Baptist preacher, and I grew up in a preacher's home, being a preacher's kid in church all the time. But they also walk the walk. I got to see it in their
Mm-hmm.
daily life. So I realized at a very early age that I was a sinner and that I needed a savior. And when I was 7 years old, I accepted Jesus into my life and was baptized. Obviously, I've had some adversity in my life, not just this thing that happened with Chase. There's been about 3 really big turning points that I can think of in my life. And each one of those tested my faith and gave me opportunity for spiritual growth. And what I've learned,
Mm-hmm.
especially when Chase died, that's the biggest battle I've faced. It took me a couple of years to really get there and to really take the pain and be able to turn the pain inward to, instead of lashing out at other people, I was never
Mm-hmm.
angry at God because I knew God was at work in all of this, but trying to understand, why is this happening? Why did this happen? Why did it happen to me? But when I took that pain and turned it inward and began to reflect on, what do I need to change? What can I change? How can I grow? Then it just really, my life began to transform, and I'm still a work in progress, but it's been an amazing journey. And yes, I miss Chase every minute of every day. But yeah, I'm a much more, it may not look like it right now, but I'm a much more resilient person than I was a few years ago. I'm a lot tougher. I sit there and I do these interventions, and there's times when these kids are like, I say kids, young people, uh, you know,
Mm-hmm.
26, 30 years old, they're right up in my face screaming at me, calling me names. And it's like, it just bounces off. It doesn't phase me. I can sit there and
Mm-hmm.
smile at them and have a conversation and bring it back down. And so, yeah, I mean, things don't really get to me that would have a few years ago.
Okay, so I know you offer one-on-one coaching to parents, and you also have
Yeah.
written a book. Where can our community learn more about those and connect with you?
Okay. So you can go to my website. It's thefamilyrecoverycoach.com. That's kind of the central hub. I'm all over. I have a podcast called When God Intervenes, and I'm on YouTube. I'm on TikTok. I'm on Facebook. You can find me just about anywhere out there. If you look for my name, Darryl Rodgers, or The Family Recovery Coach, you should be able to find me. And yeah, just reach out to me with an email or a message, and be happy to connect with you.
Excellent. And did you have any last words for our community? Any wisdom you want to share for the parents?
Yeah, I would just say love your child enough to be willing to do the hard things, the things that you know will be painful for them in the short term, but are the right thing to do. You know, and trust God with your child, with their life, and let go of those attempts to control your adult child, and you'll be rewarded in one way or another. God will honor that.
Amen. Thank you so much, Darryl, for coming on the show. And to our lovely community, thank you so much for tuning in. Share this with someone that you know needs it, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye.